Okay, lovely. Okay, well, it's great to be here today. Thank you for asking me, and thanks to the organisers, and thanks for great 2 days of papers. So I'm going to talk about meals for the dead, organic residue analysis of funerary vessels from 2 Romano-British cemeteries. Okay, yeah. So, a common feature of burials from the late Iron Age to the late Roman period are grave furnishings, which comprise suites of ceramic vessels, often thought to be associated with food and drink consumption or storage. And these might include platters, dishes, beakers, and so on, although there's considerable variability in the numbers and types of vessels from burial to burial. And they might range from single vessels up to the collections of high status dining sets, as seen here. Apologies for the quality of the picture, but I thought it was worth showing these pictures from Alton, which give you a really good idea of a high quality, high status dining set. So these vessels, do they represent a table setting where a meal was set out for the deceased? Eaten at the grave, at which the dead received a token portion. Various classical sources discuss the importance of food and drink at various stages in Roman funerary rituals, although this documentary evidence is obviously not directly applicable to Romano-British context. But nonetheless, there's lots of evidence for the consumption or deposition of food and drink as part of various funerary rituals, including animal sacrifices as part of pyre-side rituals, placement of food offerings during burial, something I'm going to speak about particularly, and the consumption of food during commemorative visits to the deceased. So as I say, there's a diverse range of foodstuffs found in burial rituals right across the Roman Empire, but specifically in Britain, in London, at the cemetery at Great Dover Street, a female cremation burial contains an impressive array of plant remains, including Mediterranean species, such as date, almond, fig, and pine nut. The Eastern Cemetery at Rome in London yielded 19 instances of animal bones. And I put these 2 pictures up. They're not from the Eastern Cemetery of Rome in London, but they give you a very good idea of the sort of animal remains that can be found in graves. So the top picture, you see the head of a suckling pig and some fragments of a domestic fowl, and then in the bottom picture, there's some pig ribs and various other animal bones in the grave. But a lot of products will not necessarily be visible archaeologically. So meat served off the bone, bread, cakes, fruit and vegetables, and liquids, including wine and oil. So the presence of these accessory vessels raises questions as to how pottery was acquired for funerary use and why specific vessels were chosen. Were they recycled from the domestic sphere, or were they made especially for funerary purposes? What was the pottery itself used for? Did the vessels contain foods for the deceased, possibly for their final journey? Or did they simply represent a symbolic meal? So I'm going to use organic residue analysis on 2 sites, Rhodaus Town, Canterbury, and the Lunt, Baginton, near Coventry, to discuss this very issue. It's just an image here of a couple of burials at Rhodaus Town, where you see the accessory vessels in the graves. So we're going to do this using organic residue analysis, and I thought I would just give you a couple of slides with a refresher in case anyone's not too knowledgeable about the technique. By far the most common form of organic residues are those preserved within the vessel form. So these are the lipids absorbed during cooking or processing of foodstuffs, and they absorb very nicely into the fabric of the vessel wall and happily sit there for up to thousands of years. And these have been found to survive in over 80% of domestic cooking pottery assemblages worldwide. It's very unusual not to find any. So what we're doing is looking for something called lipids, ancient biomolecules, and these lipids are the fats, oils, and waxes of the natural world. The types of commodities that we can identify include terrestrial and marine fats. So that would be fats from ruminant animals, milk or meat from, say, cattle, sheep and goat, or meat from pigs. Marine fats, fish, marine mammals, plant oils, waxes. So these might be leaf waxes from plants or beeswax from insects, and resins, tars and pitches. So these are the commodities we might potentially find processed in pottery. And we use a suite of chemical, molecular and chemical, molecular and isotopic techniques to investigate these, whether these commodities are present. So let's start off at Rhodaus Town, excavated fairly recently by Canterbury Archaeological Trust. And they identified an inhumation cemetery, which you can see from the image here. Contained 20 individuals in earth-cut graves. It's enclosed, here you go, and then entered via a trackway. So this cemetery was broadly contemporary with a known extramural shrine or temple situated immediately north of this particular development area. And the dating of the selected pottery vessels suggested the cemetery was in use from the late 3rd to late 4th and possibly into the early 5th century AD. So a number of features, including the unusual depth of the graves, as you can see here, suggested that this cemetery may have been for individuals of high status, i.e. the priests in charge of the shrine and their families. And I can say the ADNA did reveal some familial relationships. So there's a very large quantity and range of nice grave goods and small finds from the burials, including grave 6 of a female, which contained a glass vessel and a wooden casket holding various things such as a boar's tusk. So here we go. So this is a pottery assemblage from Rhodaus Town. And our special thanks, I don't know if Malcolm Line is here today, but he carried out the pottery analysis. And this is essentially the assemblage that I was sent. 11 of the graves contained between 1 and 3 very well preserved ceramic vessels. Essentially, apart from a couple, they were all complete. So there are a total of 20. This vessel you see at the back is a face beaker, an Oxfordshire ware vessel with an elaborate demi-rosette decoration, stamping and a face mask, as I hope you can see. So apparently that's unique. It's the only such vessel recorded from a grave anywhere within the empire. Also present, as you see, I don't know if you see me moving my mouse around, but at the front 3 and then 3 at the back, there are 6 very finely made funnel neck beakers. So I should say that one of the funnel neck beakers was a little bit broken on the rim, as was the face pot, as you can see. So that enabled me to sample those 2. And another unusual characteristic of the pots is that some are either miniature or very small. So 11 have rim diameters of up to and including 100 mil, and 3 were up to 200 mil, 1 of 240. And that 11 doesn't include the funnel neck beakers. So 20 complete, or as I say, nearly complete vessels were supplied. So 5 of the 6 funnel neck beakers were not sampled due to the restricted nature of their openings. So I should say that we've developed a modified sampling procedure to actually sample the prehistoric baby bottles, and Kate was talking about this morning. And that involves, to all you pottery specialists, if you want to put your fingers in your ears, it involves putting a modelling drill into these vessels and drilling off enough powder to sample. I decided of the 5 of the 6 funnel neck beakers, that wouldn't be practical with most of them, and I decided not to sample them. But we did sample 15. So 1 of the funnel neck beakers, which had a little bit broken off, was sampled, as was the face pot, and the others I used a modified sampling procedure. And really it's designed to minimize destructive sampling. So I should say that you know, we are really just removing the powder from inside the vessel, so it doesn't affect the outward appearance. So the lipid recovery rate for these 15 was excellent. 13 yielded lipids. The funnel neck beaker, the broken one, didn't, and another vessel also didn't, but mostly they did. So this figure here is showing you typical what are called chromatograms of 6 of the vessels, which you can see I've put on the chromatogram. And what they comprise of is, as you see, they're dominated by 2 fatty acids, the C16 and the C18 fatty acids. And these are absolutely typical of degraded animal fats. These are what we see all the time in pots right across the globe. So all we can say at this stage is that they're indicative of animal fat. It's by getting the isotope values of these 2 compounds that we can determine what type of foodstuffs were processed in the pots. But so interestingly, 5 of these vessels contained high concentration of lipids. So as I was saying earlier with regard to the baby bottles, this means they're vessels which underwent sustained use in the processing of high lipid, high fat yielding commodities. So what that tells me straight away is that 5 of the vessels did come presumably from the domestic sphere. They'd seen a lot of use in cooking. I'm going to tell you what in a minute. And the remaining 9 had low concentrations of lipids. Now, 4 of the vessels, interestingly, if you look on the two of the plots, the top right hand one, well, my right hand, your left hand, and the bottom one, you'll see these little blue triangles and these sequences of what are called longer chain fatty acids. And these are very indicative of an origin in leaf or stem epicuticular waxes. So that tells me it's consistent with the processing of plant material, likely leafy plants or very possibly plant oils, together with the animal products within these particular 4 vessels. So what was processed in the pots? Well, we were able to carry out isotope analysis on 14 pots. So 10 plot in the ruminant dairy region. That's this bottom sort of quadrant of the plot here, confirming that they were used to process dairy products. So that's milk, butter, cheese, yogurt from dairy animals, cows, sheep or goat. However, you will see that 3 of them plot at what they are still plotting within the dairy region, but they're plotting at the top of the range, and that suggests some mixing of ruminant carcass products with dairy products. A further 3 vessels were used to process ruminant meats from, again, cattle, sheep or goat, and 1 to process non-ruminant pig fats. So, okay, next slide. So apologies for all the text, but let me just talk you through this. So 3 of the vessels here were used to process ruminant carcass products, as we've said. 1 of them was the face beaker, and the lipid concentration from that was very low indeed, suggesting that it had either that it previously not been used for cooking or processing of food products, perhaps it served a decorative purpose prior to deposition in the grave, or it was especially made for funerary purposes. So meat, an offering of meat, and I would imagine possibly in the form of a prepared meal, because you couldn't exactly put a joint of meat in one of these face beakers, was then left in the vessel as an offering. So the other 2 vessels with a ruminant carcass signal, a convex-sided dish bowl, one of the bigger vessels, and a miniature line type jar, both displayed high concentrations of lipid, so suggesting that these had previously seen sustained use. So these weren't especially made for funerary purposes, but were most likely everyday cooking pots or vessels that saw use in the domestic sphere, and I want to talk a bit more about that a bit later. And the last vessel, the Haddam Greyware small necked jar, again a very small vessel, was used for pig product processing, and the lipid concentration on that one suggests that had previously seen use in the domestic sphere. So coming on to the dairy vessels, which dominate the assemblage. So 5 of these yielded very low lipid concentrations. So that suggests those vessels were made especially for funerary purposes to hold offerings of dairy products. And 4 of those 5, interestingly, were small or miniature. The remaining 4 vessels displayed very high lipid concentrations, suggesting they were vessels which, again, were used saw sustained use over a long period. And of these 4, 3 of them are again very small. And what I want to say about these small ones, it seems unlikely to me, although I'm really interested to hear what everyone thinks about this, that they're certainly not a standard cooking jar. They're quite small. So I wonder, how people think they might have been used. Okay. So the lipid signal identified in the majority of the vessels, it could come from cheese. So the Romans made both the soft sort of curd type cottage cheese, which had to be eaten fresh, or they made a hard, longer lasting cheese. And milk from cattle, sheep, goat, mares, and asses were used to make cheese. Various Roman writers have written on cheese manufacture, culinary uses of cheese. Palladius wrote a treatise on Romano-British farming in the 4th century AD, in which he discusses and gives advice on cheese making. And cheese was certainly a popular Roman foodstuff. It's part of standard rations for the army. And also with the civilian population. So if you remember, I said that 4 of the vessels containing dairy products, also included these compounds called long-chain fatty acids and alkanes, which suggest the addition of a plant offering, likely leafy plants or possibly plant oils, within these vessels. All of these had low lipid concentrations, suggesting they weren't from the domestic sphere. And this combination of dairy products and some sort of with a plant origin could originate from cheeses flavored with herbs and other plants. So Columella discusses the addition of fig sap to coagulate the curd and impart a pleasant flavor. And thyme and various other herbs were crushed and sieved into milk used to make cheese. I tend to favour more the sort of, although we can't be definitive, I tend to favour the option of cheese more than butter. Butter's not used very much in Rome at all, certainly, mainly only for cosmetics because it's quite expensive to produce, although that wouldn't be the case in Britain, where dairying seems to be quite common in some places. Or the Romans also make sour milk products. For example, this what they call oxygala, which is literally a sour milk, is essentially a yogurt, which seems to be quite often eaten with honey. So the second case study is the Lunt Fort at Baginton, and this is a mid to late 1st century Roman period, and this is a cremation cemetery. It's directly related to the Lunt Fort, only about 400 meters away. And this is one of the most significant Roman sites in this region, initially constructed in around 60 to 64 AD, possibly as a response to the Baginton revolt. And the graves here contain some with 1 or 2 complete vessels, together with large graves with multiple vessels. So the brief here was to investigate and compare vessel types and forms. There were cinerary urns as well as what was thought to be offering pots. So we looked at vessels from 7 graves, and in particular from this grave 311, which is quite a special grave, really, as you'll see from the image. So it comprised a male about 46 or over, and he was found in a greyware vessel of later 1st century date, accompanied by 23 vessels and thought to be a high-ranking officer. And as you see, the survival of the small vessels here is excellent. It's just these 3 or 4 large ones here that are sort of slightly broken along the top. So this included a really remarkable assemblage of vessels, 2 carbonated cups, probably of Spanish colour-coated ware. I think Jerry Evans is here, isn't he? So thanks to him and J.M. Mills, who did the pottery analysis. a glazeware bowl, possibly Central Gaulish, a rough cast beaker, probably Lyonsware, 2 Central Gaulish glazed miniature flagons, a well-used decorated oil lamp, and a collection of 11 Samian vessels. These were chiefly of Amatin origin and a highly unusual deposit at this date. And combined with the Gaulish and Spanish finewares from this grave, suggests the individual may not just have been of high status, but was also an immigrant from Gaul or the Mediterranean. He certainly got a good send-off anyway. So at Baginton, this is this drawing here at the bottom, as you can see, is a drawing of the graves, and just where it's marked there on the edge of that, there were some Anglo-Saxon sunken featured buildings and graves, and they also found this little miniature Saxon vessel in a domestic context, and actually sent that to me at the same time as the Baginton assemblage, which turned out to be a really good move, which for the reason for which I'm going to explain to you now or shortly. So this vessel contains a very high concentration of lipids. As you can see here, it plots very nicely in the ruminant dairy region and in the ellipse, suggesting it was solely used to process dairy products. But what this vessel does is confirm that preservation conditions at Baginton were conducive to the survival of lipids. So that's why I was particularly upset, I have to say traumatized, by the fact that we didn't get lipid results from any of the 17 vessels analysed from Baginton. And that's very, very unusual. And obviously, you know, the Saxon vessel told me that it wasn't an issue to do with the preservation conditions. It simply told us that there was no evidence for either storage or processing of foodstuffs in any of the vessels. So perhaps suggesting that funerary ritual at the Lunt didn't include the leaving of food offerings or meals for the dead, although pig and possible chicken bones were found in grave 11. So it's suggesting at least some feasting at the pyre. So, and I'm sure Jerry will have something to say about this after, but as I understand it, the quality of manufacture of at least 2 of the vessels there suggests that they might have been seconds produced by the Lunt military potter. And so bearing in mind their imperfect nature, that their status as wasters or damaged goods meant that it was expedient to use them in burials. And that does correlate really well with suggestions that pottery may have been specifically purchased at the time of the funeral, possibly bought at markets or at stalls set up near cemeteries, and or from burial societies which may have kept a supply of potters' seconds or rejects, or even that they may have been disinterred from earlier funerals and reused. Certainly there are many incidences of old, repaired, imperfect or damaged vessels in burials found at various sites: Ospinge, Kent, Silchester, Tenter Street, London, and so on. And of the 200 mostly complete vessels covered at the large East London Roman cemetery, a total of 23% were damaged in some way. So while that doesn't necessarily mean these vessels were not previously used for cooking or storage or so on, the authors did suggest that it might imply that when choosing vessels for burial, damaged pieces were frequently selected. So in conclusion, what we can say is that some domestic pottery was moved to the funerary realm. Other vessels presumably must have been purchased for use as funerary vessels, either in the case of Baginton perhaps to show a symbolic meal, or in other instances to hold offerings. Seconds or wasters were used in some instances, and there's a variability in burial practices, obviously between the 2 sites, but also between burials at Canterbury. Some vessels came from the domestic sphere, and others clearly were bought for use as offering vessels. So here we have the first identification of dairy products as food offerings, something that we wouldn't be able to get at previously without organic residue analysis. And very interestingly, dairy products mixed with leafy plants, perhaps some sort of special dairy product, like something like a cheese or something prepared as an offering specifically. Meat was also deposited, pork and meat from cattle, sheep and goat, but very likely, at least in the instance of the beaker pot, as a prepared meal rather than as a joint of meat. So the last two really sort of come together. There's still, I think, a lot more discussion and required on the function of these. Certainly a larger project out there, and I'm very intrigued as to the small or miniature nature of some of the vessels, as to how commonplace they are in other contexts, and what people think they may have been used for, if how they may have been used to process foodstuffs. Okay, so just like to thank everyone at the Canterbury Archaeological Trust and Archaeology Warwickshire, including everyone mentioned there, and particularly the pottery specialists, who are, at least I think one of whom is here today. Thank you.